Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1, action.
Assume nothing.
Brash, bald-faced blasphemy.
Question everything.
I find it extremely hard to imagine.
Open your eyes.
It is quite all right to be an atheist.
The fastest growing group of people in the country has been measured as being those who have no belief or who are atheists.
You don't have to be apologetic or quiet about it.
Challenge the opposition.
You see religion on 100 fronts losing the argument.
And start thinking. This is The Thinking Atheist Worldwide.
I was in 6th grade at a fundamentalist elementary school, Christian school, and a guy came in. We had a special guest, and he was a sex educator. A Christian sex educator. Well, on that particular day, they divided the class up. They took the boys out, and they took them into one separate room, and they took the girls to a different room with a female teacher. And we began a class, an hour-long class about sex education, 6th grade. And I don't remember a lot of the specifics. It has been so many years ago, but a few things pop into my mind. First of all, he brought out these charts, actual posters. And he was pointing to, this part, and this is what this does, and this is how this works. It was very basic stuff, but still news to many of us. Oh, really? That's what that does? Just enough information to make us dangerous, essentially. And we only spoke about the boys. We only spoke about male anatomy. We only spoke about male sexuality, of course, in a Christian context. And he said something near the end of the presentation that I will never forget. And it was very curious. He looked at us very sternly and he said, "Never, ever go and study diagrams of a woman's body and a woman's anatomy like we have done today with the male. It is inappropriate." Essentially setting us up to be ignorant about how female anatomy works, how a male and female body might interact, right? We knew a few things about ourselves, just enough to make us dangerous, and then they sort of threw us to the wolves. By the way, if you experience feelings of lust or desire, and you linger on those feelings any more than a second or so, you are now in sin. The devil is in your skull. He's climbing through your mind. He's tainting your perceptions about healthy Christian sexuality. You're under attack. You're weak. You need to drop to your knees and pray for forgiveness. This is a prison. 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, you're having these thoughts, you're having these desires, you're doing these actions, and all of a sudden you feel that ping of guilt in your mind. I'm in sin, I'm broken, I'm screwing it up, Jesus is watching me. There was a time in my life I remember, and it didn't matter what it was. I was pretty young at the time, maybe 5th grade, 6th grade-ish. I remember whatever would happen, I would always under my breath whisper a prayer for forgiveness. If I had an angry thought, or if I thought something inappropriate, or said something that I wasn't sure might please Jesus, I was always under my breath kind of whispering, "Dear Lord, please forgive me for all my sins and cleanse me. Dear Lord, please forgive me and purify me. Dear Lord, please help me to be stronger next time." I was always doing that under my breath. I must have done it 50 times a day. It's like you always felt the need to reset, right? Everything I do is a sinful creature. Everything I think is a sinful creature is essentially tainted or worldly. I'm a worldly creature. I was born carnal. I was born broken. I'm in constant need of a reset. I'm like the Etch-a-Sketch. You got to shake me to clear me about every 30 seconds, lest there be sin in my mind and then in my body. Sex, in many ways, especially in the context of fundamentalist Christianity, became like the forbidden fruit. The less we knew about it, the more of a mystery it was, the more we were intrigued by it. What are these desires? What are these feelings? What's happening? But we were hamstrung because we hadn't properly been educated. In fact, we'd been miseducated about the things that were happening, the natural inclinations and thoughts and desires that we were having. It was a prison. My email inbox is loaded with stories from people who were screwed up by religious teaching, by the church, that so often taught sexuality based on the preaching and teachings of people who didn't understand anything about anything. Dragging these bad ideas into their relationships, into their marriages, through their divorces, navigating guilt and shame, punishing themselves for doing what human beings do naturally, for thinking and feeling what human beings think and feel naturally. Many people never escape. This broadcast is about how religion screws up our sex lives. It will feature the stories and perspectives of many of my listeners, a great many of whom have asked to remain anonymous, and I will certainly be a good steward of their identities and make sure that they do remain anonymous. I've got Dr. Darrell Ray, who's always a wonderful resource when it comes to speaking about sex. He, of course, is the author of the book Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. I'll be speaking with a trauma counselor and educator named Vanessa Farn. She specializes in working with people who have been sexually abused by members of the clergy. We're going to talk to her about the specific kinds of trauma that those circumstances cause and how to get past them. And David Fitzgerald, he's an author, and he has given presentations across the country called Sexy Violence, Violent Sex, the Weird-Ass Morality of the Bible. And I knew this would be a fantastic addition to this show. You want to know what the Bible really thinks and says about sex beyond the happy-clappy platitudes and bumper stickers that these relationship pastors preach from the pulpit? You want to know what the Bible really says about sex? Hang on for David Fitzgerald. It will be enlightening. In fact, grab some religious friends, some devout Christian friends, and keep a Bible handy. And when he speaks about some specifics and they say that's not in there, you can just flip right over and you can pull up the reference and have that whole conversation. It's going to be beautiful. Next Tuesday's broadcast, by the way, is called God, Guns, and Glory, Religion and the Military. We're going to talk about the influence of religious ideas, religious thinking, religious practices in military culture. I'm going to be speaking with Mikey Weinstein from the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, and we'll talk to people who are or have been actively involved in military service who've experienced firsthand the whole God and country thing. That's coming up next Tuesday. I've been watching an interesting lecture series on the Great Courses Plus about paleontologists as detectives. It's really fascinating stuff about how we discover and analyze and reconstruct the story of our past using fossils, and how do you allow for things like our own biases and whatnot. A great example being, of course, the T-Rex, which in movies is depicted this specific way. But in the fossil record, and from what we can reconstruct, the T-Rex is a much different creature that acted in a much different way. It's really fascinating. Paleontologists as Detectives is part of A New History of Life, which is a lecture series at the Great Courses Plus. Now, the Great Courses Plus is a wonderful library of over 8,000 video lectures on a huge host of subjects. Of course, paleontology and archaeology, religious history, English grammar, foreign languages, logic, philosophy, computer programming, so much more. Renowned professors streaming their lectures directly to your computer, TV, or smartphone. And my listeners get the first full month free when you sign up with my special URL, thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. Check it out. Get your free month and make your computer, TV, or phone your personal university. Thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. Thegreatcoursesplus.com/Seth. My first email is from someone who has asked to remain anonymous. I will call her Kay. She says, I'm 27 years old, and I have never had sex. I suppose I can blame religion for ruining my sex life, but if I'm honest, it's actually a combination of factors. My mother sent me off to Sunday school without much thought. She had lived a wild youth and wanted me to have a different experience. She was saved about a month after I was. I was 6, by the way, and she didn't talk much about sex. She basically waited until I was 10 and taught me the mechanics and told me not to do it. It wasn't something she wanted to discuss. I was taught why not to do it at church, though thankfully she found the church lessons ridiculous, or I might have had a worse experience. I came home talking about how we should date to find a mate, and she called it ridiculous. I mentioned a fight with a friend over the proper role of dating. I found value in dating without marriage in mind, and he was taking me to task with Scripture. She called both the argument and his viewpoint ridiculous. I asked her about submitting to my husband, and she told me not to depend on a man. In many ways, she was possibly trying to counteract the messages I was hearing because she hadn't been raised in youth group and did not know what I was being taught, only that if it came from church, she could trust it. But even as she heard me telling her the disagreeable positions I was learning, she stressed the value of going to church and believing what they taught, especially hell and punishment for sin. She stressed her experiences with alcohol and sex leading to consequences. By the time I was 12 and she was pregnant with my baby sister, I did the math and realized that the consequences she referred to were an unintended pregnancy that kept her from graduating college. That pregnancy resulted in me. My existence was a consequence, and to this day I struggle with viewing myself as more than someone else's punishment. She loves me and never treated me like a punishment. But it's hard to shake that feeling when you're being told that pregnancy is the worst thing that could happen to you. As I grew up, she emphasized not getting pregnant, expressed disappointment in classmates who got pregnant, told me to be thankful I didn't have a baby when I worried about my future. Abortion was out of the question, of course, so if I got pregnant, I would have to keep it. Meanwhile, I was in a college Baptist ministry group at a public university and was being told, "No bang bing until you have the ring." Kay, did they really say that? No bang bing until you have the ring. I had a good friend give a speech at a weeknight worship service asking the women to dress more modestly to help their Christian brothers with lust. I had a boyfriend break up with me for being a temptation 2 days after he told me he wanted to fuck me. So on the one hand, I had the church telling me the typical admonitions against premarital sex and my body being an object of lust for men. I had my mother decrying most of these harmful teachings, but adding in her own belief that pregnancy can ruin your life. I came to the conclusion that sex was this awful, sinful act, and that the punishment would be a child. To this day, even though I deconverted almost 3 years ago, minus 6 months where I fell off the wagon, and can say the word atheist out loud to myself without panic, I am afraid of sex. I still think I will be punished. I never want a child to be born as my punishment. Kay, thank you for sharing your story. My next email is a guy who I will call M. He said, I've been an atheist my whole life, but my parents were raised in religious homes. Father Baptist, mother Jewish, my religious parents. Though my parents lost their faiths by the time I was old enough to be interested in sex, my mother especially was still uber conservative when it came to the topic of sex. It wasn't to be spoken of in mixed company. Sideways allusions to it were taboo. Having sex at all was a big, giant deal, etc. My rational brain convinced me by an appropriate age that sex didn't have to be a big deal, but the brain rarely defeats emotion. It was always a big deal. I'm closing in on 35 years old and still hesitate and sometimes opt not to pull the trigger when a situation presents itself. I'm single. Just because I was conditioned to accept that sex is some sort of danger or eternal pact or, well, I don't even know, but some inherently big deal that needs 100 times more braking than accelerating. Ultimately, that timidity and associated resulting factors have cost me 2 relationships, the latter of which I'm still agonizing over years later, which of course further impacts my sex life. And I really don't think it's so much because of my parents' religion as it is because of their parents' religions and the corresponding upbringing of my parents that trickled down to me. Area code 510, you are on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. Tell me your name.
Bethany.
Bethany, the topic of the broadcast is religion screwed up my sex life. What do you think?
Well, I was raised in what you might consider a bubble. So I was homeschooled, home churched, the whole thing. And so for me, there was a couple things at play. And one of the basic things was that my flesh was evil. So getting to know my body I was already off on the wrong foot because I had seen myself as evil. And on top of that, my parents used a severe form of corporal punishment, which confused pain and pleasure. And it made me step back, if you will, in pursuing, as I got older, pursuing anything about sexuality. And so I'm kind of a late bloomer.
Okay, now help me understand the confusion of pain and pleasure when it comes to punishment. Can you flesh that out for me?
Yeah, so in my community, they believed that children were born sinful, so we were undressed, and they hit us with a stick on the buttocks. And so if you happen to be one of those individuals that's a very sensitive place for you sexually, as it was for me, then as I'm going through this ritual of being spanked, I'm experiencing pleasure and I'm also experiencing excruciating pain. So it was very confusing for me.
Okay, well, I wanted to clarify that for the listener. So you grew up confused from the outset?
Yes. And so I spent a lot of time disassociated from my body. And so by the time I was, of age and out dating, it was difficult. And I basically said that I was saving myself for marriage, but I was really avoiding sex altogether. And it wasn't until I reached my 30s and began to read things like The Ethical Slut and, go into communities. I live in the Bay Area, so I'm in communities that are very sexually positive. And so, I got a lot of help from that community.
How much of your teenage years were dominated by guilt, right? You have an urge, you have a thought, you have an instinct, you have an impulse, and all of a sudden you realize you're in sin. It must be the whispers of Satan himself, right?
That didn't hit me until I was in my 20s. I was so dissociated from my body that I wasn't having thoughts. I was completely shut down. I was around others. My siblings were expressing themselves and expressing guilt, but I wasn't myself. I wasn't experiencing that until I was in my 20s. And then I started to develop more, and I was away from my community. So I was doing more exploring.
Did you date in school?
No, I didn't date until I was in my early 20s. I was 21 or so.
So how far behind the curve were you from everybody around you?
I was really far away. And it set me up because by the time that I did have sex for the first time, I had it with a man that I later married, and he was disaster. He was abusive. So he was the one that actually, because I didn't have any sex ed growing up. I knew how, I kind of had a vague idea how babies were made, but I didn't have formal education around sex. I didn't know a lot about it until I was a lot older.
Did you marry the first guy you met? Did it work out like that? The first one who showed interest? The first one you went on a date with?
No, the first man that I had sex with. And I married when I was 26.
Okay.
And so he was a lot older than me, and he had, some background in medicine. And so he was way more comfortable with his body. And so he was willing to help me. But what I didn't realize is he wasn't the guy to marry. But I felt like I had sinned and had given myself to him physically, so that it was already a done deal.
You believe there was a body and soul connection. And once you have sex, there's a spiritual bonding that takes place that is supposed to be for life, for the rest of your life.
Exactly. So I wasn't looking at him. Was he a good partner? Was he going to, bring me happiness? I was already done. It was already done.
It's unusual conducting these types of interviews because, the very nature of the subject that we're dealing with, that we're talking about very sensitive issues. So when I ask a question, I'm trying to ask them respectfully, but also from a point of curiosity. And I know our listeners are curious as well. In the bedroom, night number one, are you completely unprepared?
I was taught from the get-go, from the time I was really little, that I wasn't supposed to, I was supposed to obey a man. And so when it came to the bedroom, I didn't have any ideas of my own. I followed whatever he wanted. And so, and because I also at that time, it took me a while to understand that I myself had my own sex drive. So I was not aware of it at the time that I was marrying him. So it was more about pleasing him and doing what he wanted. So I found sex very painful, confusing, not something I looked forward to, something I endured. And I wouldn't find out that sex was great until after I left him, which is about 14 years later.
14 years.
Yes.
You found yourself then dreading when he would express interest and you could sort of see the writing on the wall. Hey, wait, tonight he might want to be intimate. In your heart, you're thinking, how do I avoid this? How can I get out of this? How can I prevent this? Are those things happening in your mind?
Oh, absolutely. And because pain and pleasure were confused for me and love was confused, my parents used corporal punishment as a form of loving me. I believed that my husband was, even though he shamed me, he belittled me, he emotionally abused me, I thought that those things were okay because love was just something that hurt. And so I didn't understand that one could be in a relationship where, you really did feel like you were on equal footing and you yourself, like I didn't feel like I didn't know any other way. And so the love pain thing messed a lot of aspects up for me in a relationship with a man.
Did he brandish a religious belief, though? I mean, was he a quote-unquote godly man, or did he speak the language of religion?
No, and that's why I thought, I thought he was going to be really different from my upbringing. He was a humanist and probably more agnostic. He was an outright atheist, but he was
Well, he wasn't
more
that much of a
agnostic.
humanist if he was causing you pain and anguish. I mean, if he's abusive, he's not that much of a humanist.
No, but that was his label.
Wow.
That's how he saw himself. Benevolent tyrant.
The way through this gauntlet, then, the way to better ideas, the way to finding comfort in your own skin as a sexual being, how did this happen for you?
Well, I got rid of him. That was the first start, and I launched into life on my own in my 40s, and I moved to the Bay Area permanently and found residence, and then just began to find Planned Parenthood. I ended up at Planned Parenthood because I was a homeschool kid with no sex ed. So, I'm in my 40s and Planned Parenthood, like explaining everything that I need to know in order to be a sexual human being, and then there was a few other organizations within the Bay Area that were really helpful. And so I could ask the idiot questions and get really good information. And then I became sexually active in the sex positive group, which has been huge to be around people who see sex as beautiful and pleasurable and not the negative that I had come to know it as.
Bethany, are mom and dad still around?
Yes.
And what do they think about all this?
They're sad. I live in a poly community, and so I have multiple loving relationships with multiple people, and for them it's a huge disappointment, and it will keep me out of heaven.
They're probably thinking about those scriptures where the sinners are given over to the lust of the flesh kind of thing.
Yes. The community I'm in now is way like that family connection, having multiple lovers and friends and everyone in the community. It's so incredibly supportive that it's been a really happy ending or a new beginning for me.
I've had some people ask if I'd do a whole show on polyamory. I didn't think that I was ready to commit an entire broadcast to it, but it is a fascinating subject, and it's something I'm hearing more about every single day. It's something that many people don't understand, even in the atheist culture, yeah?
Right. No, it's very misunderstood, but I have found it to be a good fit for me.
Are you happy? You doing all right?
Yes, I'm very happy.
Bethany, you sound happy, and that makes me happy. Thanks for being a part of the broadcast and the conversation. I'm so glad you navigated through, and all my best for 2017 and beyond, okay?
Thank you.
I'm always interested in watching people who are not heterosexual, but who continue to embrace and promote and extol and love Christ and Christianity. There's a woman named Vicky Beeching. She's a British musician and religious commentator, They played a lot of her songs on Christian pop radio in the early 2000s, and they may continue to play her music today. I don't really know. She's been part of the contemporary Christian worship scene, and she's appeared on various television shows and been interviewed on radio stations around the country and around the world. Vicki Beeching is a devout Christian who is gay. And she wrote an article for The Independent, which was published in April of 2015. It said, "I tried to pray the gay away and ended up in a hospital bed. I still bear the scars of being told I could change my orientation." Part of the article says this: "I've been a Christian all my life and come from a conservative church background. The churches I attended from childhood made it very clear that being gay was not an option for Christians. So as I entered my teens and realized I was attracted to women and not men, it created a horrendous level of shame, fear, and despair within me. I remained silent about this secret for years. I told a Catholic priest at the age of 14, hoping that he could pray away the gay. He heard my formal confession and said a prayer of forgiveness over me. That didn't work, and as a result, my sense of shame increased. My impressionable teenage mind concluded that perhaps I was just too broken for even God to fix. At 16, I attended a church meeting where people stood at the front and shared how God had set them free from various struggles, including one girl who said she'd been set free from homosexuality. Vulnerable to these teachings, I asked the Christians at the meeting to pray for me to stop having same-sex feelings. They began doing what felt like a form of exorcism, commanding demons of homosexuality to come out, shouting passionately and gathering others around me to join in with the prayers. It confused and scared me, as previously I'd not thought of my same-sex feelings as anything other than emotional or psychological. To be told that they were actually demonic was chilling and left me feeling shaken to the core. The prayer session didn't work, and as a result, I developed a frightening level of self-rejection toward my orientation, seeing it as something separate to my true self, something sinister and even evil. To escape my feelings I was having toward other women, I threw myself into my job and became a total workaholic by the time I reached my mid-20s. My work was in Christian music and speaking, so the negative teachings about same-sex relationships were something I was constantly exposed to, week in and week out, believing I'd never be able to have a life partner. I buried the pain by taking on more and more work until my body grew so stressed and exhausted that I developed an autoimmune condition. Laying in a hospital bed, undergoing chemotherapy to treat it, I realized I needed to reassess my life and to come to terms with being gay. I came out in an interview with The Independent last summer, and again, that was in 2015, so she would have come out in 2014, at the age of 35. I still bear the scars of being told I could change my orientation if I just prayed hard enough, and the shame and trauma that results from those teachings and those practices. Conversion therapy is often justified by its practitioners because everyone deserves the right to seek help if they want it. They often use the language of freedom of speech and freedom of choice to defend their work. This is totally flawed logic. Yes, everyone who wants therapy related to their sexual orientation should be free to seek it. However, the therapy they receive should be totally unbiased. Otherwise, there's no genuine element of freedom of choice. Conversion therapy is, in its very essence, utterly weighted toward heterosexuality, as it is founded on the belief that being gay is a sign of brokenness and sin. And she continues to go on to talk about how she has found a wonderful, balanced, happy Christian life as a gay person. Of course, you and I are having the same thought. Have you read your Bible? Are you aware of the Bible's teachings, of Yahweh's teachings about homosexuals and homosexuality? And is this yet another example of someone simply cherry-picking and constructing the God and or Jesus that suits their own individual, personalized, sort of handcrafted faith? But I'm happy for Vicky Beeching in the fact that at least she's not dragging around these bad ideas. At least she has separated herself from the fundamentals of Christianity to the point where she can at least be who she is in that way. You know, never take sex advice, Vicky, from people who thought the earth had corners and who believed donkeys could talk and that magic mud could cure blindness. Never take advice from these people. I'm guessing that Vicky Beeching has constructed this sort of happy, clappy Joel Osteen Jesus that makes rainbows and mountain vistas and beautiful babies and loves all the little children of the world. She's probably worshiping that Jesus, and she's just decided, the rest of the Bible kind of is what it is. We'll just put it over here in a corner and not worry about it. She's not the only Christian artist to have come out as gay. Ray Boltz was an artist who was hugely popular in the 1990s. He had a couple of big songs. One was called Watch the Lamb. The other was called Thank You. He came out as gay and I think was pretty much ostracized from the Christian community. Jennifer Knapp was another hugely popular artist when I was on the radio. She came out as gay, and I think the same thing may have happened to her. But it's interesting to watch because now the inside culture of Christianity, just like the Catholic Church and whatnot, having to deal with what do we do with these people who are becoming more bold about saying that, hey, you know, I am who I am. My sexuality is what it is, and everybody else is going to have to just deal with it. The church is having to wrestle with that. In the last paragraph of the article that Vicky Beeching had written for The Independent, she said that she longs for the day when the church teaches a positive, inclusive message that you don't have to choose between your faith and your sexuality. What kind of Christianity is that? Homosexuals executed according to the fundamental, foundational document of Christianity. Executed for being gay. Whole cities wiped out for people being gay. And yet Vicky Beeching says you don't have to choose between Christianity and your sexuality. These two concepts do not jive. She says Christianity is gradually moving in an LGBT inclusive direction, and it's heartening to watch. A self-fashioned, custom-built Christianity that with each passing day looks less and less like Christianity. I find this very interesting. Vanessa Farn is an educator and a trauma counselor, and I've asked Vanessa to join us for the broadcast to weigh in on some of this. Thanks for being here, Vanessa. Good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Can you sort of outline the nature of your work, the kind of stuff you do?
I am a counselor in Wisconsin. I specialize in trauma recovery, and I am also training to be a sex therapist.
Do you have experiences with how religion influences thinking and behavior in regard to sex and sexuality?
Yes, I do. I specialize in working with survivors of sexual abuse, and many times I have run into clients who have had not only survivors, but mainly survivors who have some very difficult ways of managing their ideas around sex because of what they've been taught, especially if they have been abused by a religious leader.
There's a whole other layer there, isn't there? I mean, this is someone that you trust. This is God's proxy. I mean, if you can't trust your pastor or preacher or priest, who can you trust?
Well, yes. Unfortunately, that does create a lot of issues because not only are we dealing with the shame from the abuse, but then it's magnified by the idea that there is a leader who is comparable to God, perhaps, depending on the age of the survivor. But also that concept of being raped by a religious leader could be, I guess, comparable to being raped by God at the very worst concept of how people would try and figure that out. But the other part of it is really that distorts a sense of their identity, their worthiness, and also the concept of when we work with trauma survivors of who is there to help is really a big part of how people recover. And if there is this idea that God is always watching, as what we're told when we're kids for discipline most of the time, that God is watching and is not helping. And that's probably the hardest part to come back from, is understanding that if there is that cognitive kind of distortion around this is a representative of God, or this is a person who is higher than us as humans, who has a higher moral standard, that then also God is somehow involved in that. And it depends. Not everybody has that idea, but it's not difficult to kind of extend it to that piece where God is a bystander.
If God didn't want it to happen, he would have stepped in. He would have prevented it. He would have protected me. Is that some of the thinking you're seeing?
Yes, and that's the thing is, if God is a bystander, that means the survivor is completely and utterly alone. Because people say, why didn't you say anything? Well, then why would you? If God is all-knowing and knows, then why would you say anything? Because nobody's going to do anything. If God's not going to do anything, then who else is?
Now, here we have the church, though. They're waiting in the wings. They've got recovery ministries of every stripe and shape, and they are waiting for the wounded so that they can bring the wounded in and help rebuild them. The challenge is that they're rebuilding them using superstitious ideas written thousands of years ago. As a mental health professional, this is a challenge. I'm sure you see people who are dealing with real-world problems using supernatural explanations and solutions.
Yes, and the other part of that is that there is this idea of humans as having higher moral standards, or just being higher beings, and we really forget about our neurobiology, and that's the other piece that's really difficult too sometimes, helping people understand that our bodies respond in certain ways because we are, to quote Dr. Jill Taylor, she's very good in talking about neurobiology and that sort of thing, but we are feeling bodies who think. So our neurobiology is really important when it comes to sex, but that isn't something that anybody really talks about. When we're teaching our kids, it's really all about morality. And when religion is introduced to that piece, and then you have a religious leader who is actually perpetuating the abuse, that is such a cognitive distortion. It's really hard for people to come back from.
How does someone recover? From your experience, what is the pathway towards getting past, if you ever do get past, this kind of sexual trauma in your life?
Well, first of all, it's possible to get past the trauma. It really is. Sometimes it's a longer road for others, depending on what has happened, depending on the support that they have, depending on where they're at in their recovery piece. And I say recovery is trauma, but really to understand that it is possible. I've seen people come back from really, really difficult abusive situations and go on to lead really sexually whole lives. It's a process. And I think the thing to remember, too, for people who may be listening who are considering going to therapy, to really, really interview their therapist, to make sure their therapist has the training, has additional training around trauma counseling, is able to, talk to them without judgment, because that's the biggest piece to understand when people are recovering, that there is so much shame around sex and sexual activity that is being taught through religious practices that they're carrying so much that they do not need that additional judgment from their therapist. And if they feel judged, challenge their therapist. And if their therapist really is not able to manage that with their own personal feelings, because we're humans too. Therapists are humans. We have our own stuff that we deal with. But if a person feels that their therapist is not helping, challenge them. Let them know. But first and foremost, interview the person. Know that that person has the training to be able to help them through it.
That's an interesting perspective. You don't walk in saying, well, you're the therapist, I will now defer to you in all things. You have the right to sort of vet the therapist to find out which platform the therapist is operating from. I mean, there's a difference between a therapist who has a personal religious belief, but who operates in the science of mental health, and then the person who is a religious believer who allows that belief to sort of filter into the therapy mechanisms.
That's the thing, is that we have this idea that we just do whatever that person says, and that's giving away our power, and our power has already been taken away by the abuse. So knowing that it's a collaborative relationship, that there is the ability to be able to challenge your therapist, but foremost, it's training. Really, really go to your therapist and research the person before you go. I always recommend that my clients research me before they even come in when I get the first call. And that's the other thing, too, is understanding that when you call, and if you don't feel very good about what you're getting in terms of just that first call, because sometimes it takes up to 6 or 7 times before a person will actually make that call. If you don't feel cared for, if you don't feel like this is going to be a good fit, then don't go and find somebody else. That's not always easy, though.
Dr. Darrell Ray is joining me in just a little bit on the broadcast, and he has spoken often about the Secular Therapist Project, which is a way of sort of vetting the therapists who do not drag a superstitious belief system into their therapy or therapy solutions and sessions. And it's a sort of an offshoot of recovering from religion. If someone is looking for a secular therapist, it might be a good resource for them. They have, at this moment, almost 300 secular therapists available, and the website is seculartherapy.org. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Vanessa Farn, thank you so much for being a part of the broadcast. It's been great to have you today.
Thank you.
Teachings about sexual purity are huge in the church. You know what's also big in church culture? Porn. Christian Today posted an October 2014 article titled, "America's Bible Belt states indulge in more online porn than other less religious states." Researchers at Brock University in Ontario, Canada, compiled 2 years' worth of data using Google Trends across the United States, and they made an interesting discovery. The U.S. states that were more religiously conservative and politically conservative, with cultures that have higher degrees of sexual restriction, those states showed more web searches for things like free porn or XXX. Those same states also had higher rates of image searches for sexual pictures. Christian Today quoted a recent Barna study that was commissioned by Proven Men Ministries that found that between Christian men and non-Christian men, both groups used porn at the same rate. A massive 79% of Christian men ages 18 to 30 said they watched porn at least once a month. Nearly a third of those people said they watch porn every day. And the women are also in the act, if you'll pardon my phrasing. 15% of Christian women admitted to viewing porn at least once a month. Well, Proven Men Ministries is an organization, it's one of many out there, that says it's pledged to help men break free from porn addiction or sexual addiction. There's a 12-week study program and various forms of, quote, accountability. So if you have lustful thoughts or you're thinking about watching porn or whatever, I guess you call a buddy or you've got some accountability partner who walks you through it, talks you off the ledge. The founder, allegedly a porn addict who found his own liberation through God. And they say the Proven Men method is designed to rewire your brain so that in your path of pornography, you have roadblocks and exit ramps, their terminology. Roadblocks and exit ramps. And the site lists a bunch of articles about sexual purity, how to teach and promote sexual purity, and how sexually explicit material taints a relationship with God. Of course, all of this feeds into the conversations about shame and about guilt and about sin and worth and all these things. We're going to get into more of that with Dr. Darrell Ray just a little later on in this broadcast. And that brings me to another article online. If you'll forgive a brief digression from the seriousness of this topic, Landover Baptist Church is a satire website. Many people mistake it for a legitimate ministry or church. Landover Baptist Church is satire. It's The Onion, except it's about church stuff. And there was an article that it had posted on biblical sexuality And the article's headline said this: Pastor orders Christian men to only think about Jesus while masturbating. Oh, I got to read this. The Landover Conference of Deacons last week passed one of the most controversial resolutions of the church's 200-year history. The organization has once again lessened restrictions on self-gratification. All church members know that the controversy on this issue reached a new height last year when Landover lowered the allowable age of masturbation to 65 for recent widowers. The church has revised that policy yet again. Quote, "We really had no choice," noted a tired and distraught Pastor Deacon Fred during a news conference held shortly after the decision was reached. Last month, several middle-aged divorced men challenged the church policy. They claimed that because they can never remarry, since to do so would constitute adultery according to Matthew 5:32, and because they cannot have non-marital sex, since fornication ensures eternity in hell, 1 Corinthians 6:9 and 10, they should at least be allowed to defile their bodies as a consolation. Needless to say, we put very little stock in the words of men who would put their wives away, but they challenged us to find any Bible verse prohibiting masturbation. After 72 hours of searching the Lord's Word, we came up empty-handed, if you'll pardon the expression. We even consulted 17th century Bible scholar Brother Harry Hardwick, but he too could find nothing prohibiting flesh-pulling. Everyone knows that all Landover rules come straight from the Bible. We don't ignore the parts we don't like, as the John 3:16 pseudo-Christians do, nor do we add to the Bible, like those Pope-loving Catholics. Our new policy is not without its limitations, however. While the Bible does not outlaw masturbation, it severely restricts the circumstances under which it may occur, noted Pastor Deacon Fred. The first restriction is that no Landover gentleman will be permitted to reach the stage of ejaculation. The Bible is very clear that a man's seed is for copulation only, noted the pastor. In fact, the Bible says that when Onan chose not to copulate and instead released his seed on the ground, God was so angry that he struck Onan dead. Genesis chapter 38, verses 9 and 10. The last thing we need is some media scandal, as reporters click photos of colored janitors removing corpses from Landover restrooms. Recognizing that a few men may err and sin by not stopping in time, the new policy requires all who decide to participate in the act to register with Pastor Deacon Fred. Specially made Tupperware seed containers will be signed out of his office by Mrs. Watkins, who will be keeping a record to guard against overuse. The sinner must catch his mistake in his numbered container before it reaches the ground. All containers are to be returned to Mrs. Watkins within 1 hour of checkout. The contents will be collected each week in a larger vat and provided to Mary Lou's Christian Salon, where it will be used to treat dry, scaly skin. I'm almost done. The second restriction is that no man will be permitted to have any sexual thoughts during the process. The apostles told us repeatedly that Jesus forbids lust, since sex is for baby-making, not anxiety release, continued the pastor. We are to abstain from fleshly lusts, 1 Peter 2:11, and flee also youthful lusts, 2 Timothy 2:22. For lust bringeth forth death, James 1:15, and more to the point for those debauched divorcees. Matthew told us that whoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. Matthew 5:28. This means that masturbation of an erect organ can occur only if the erection is naturally induced, such as by the morning sun or an overfilled bladder. Pastor Deacon Fred then concluded the only way to masturbate without lust is to keep your mind on Christ at all times. You can always count on Landover Baptist to demonstrate absurdity by being absurd. Amber Barnhill has been featured on the Friendly Atheist blog in an article called How Abstinence-Only Sex Education Led Me Down an Unexpected Path, and she has spoken out about her own story, and she joins me for this portion of the broadcast. Amber, it's good to have you.
Thank you for having me.
All right, give me the short version of your story, but tell me your story. What happened?
Oh, there's not a short version.
Okay, well, give me the long version of your story. Just tell me what happened to you.
Well, I listened to your podcast on the homeschooling cult, and I'm really, really glad that the Duggars became famous because that makes it so easy for me to explain to people my past.
All right, well, let's synopsize that for those who aren't familiar with the Duggars and their particular brand of homeschool. They're the stars of 19 Kids and Counting. They've been embroiled in a huge scandal after I think the oldest son was exposed as a child molester or molesting his siblings, and it's just been a nightmare. All of that on top of the nightmare that was the curriculum that these children were being taught from. Would that be a fair way to synopsize that?
Yeah, the gender role thing is just really, really Victorian. They like to consider themselves old-fashioned, which is kind of ironic because if you keep up with them, they slowly stay a few paces behind everybody else while they still pretend like they never change, but they do. But yeah, I went to Hyles-Anderson College, and I don't know if you're familiar with Jack Hyles and Jack Scott. Jack Scott is in prison now. He was my pastor. He ended up molesting, having an affair with, I think she was 14. One of the girls he was counseling, he told her that God wanted them to have sex with each other, and he had his helpers bring her across state lines and all this crazy stuff. So the church that I went to has been in the news quite a bit for that specific kind of thing. But it's one of those hidden kind of independent fundamental Baptist kind of areas. And then, the one that I went to, we had, like I heard someone else talking about, and your other podcast with, this is a specific hallway that girls walk on, and this is a specific hallway that boys walk on at certain times of the day. They termed it dating areas, and then after specific times, you weren't allowed to be in this area with a member of the opposite sex. I had a friend who got caught kissing her boyfriend, or fiance, I think even, and they got in huge trouble. Another friend of mine had sex with her boyfriend, and she was just so ridden with guilt that she finally admitted it to me in private when we were on a bus because girls weren't allowed to go anywhere by themselves, so we had to ride buses everywhere. And so someone overheard her and went and ratted her out, and she got expelled.
When you're in college, you must have been like watching a car wreck, or did you buy into it at the time? I mean, were you looking at it with horror, or did you?
I bought into it.
Really?
And that's, and yes, and I have some guilt now because I can empathize with people who hate me because I've been exactly where they are. And I can look back and see how, I don't want to think that I'm that hateful, but I can look back and see how I unintentionally, in the name of Christian love, treated other people badly. And I thought I was doing the right thing, and I've ostracized myself from people who were sinful. I remember when I was a teenager, a friend of mine, she wasn't in the same religion as me, but she would read those dime store romance novels, and I shamed her so much for that. It was like a huge, huge damper in our friendship, the fact that she read about sex and she wasn't married yet.
From your perspective, then, it was sort of, be ye separate, right? I need to be above all this.
Yeah.
I need to call out the sexual sins.
Yeah, you were supposed to. It was just the devil and demons were in everything and everywhere. And for girls especially, we couldn't go anywhere by ourselves. The rules at the college that I went to were, if you were a girl, you had to have either an approved staff member and a group of 3, or it had to be your dad or your brother that you could go out with. That was it.
So when exactly did the college expect all of you to be grown-ups, to be able to conduct yourselves independently?
Never if you were a girl. The rules were totally different for the guys.
Amber, you'd done an article where you had addressed the issue of marital rape. Is that something you're comfortable speaking about here?
Yes. I'm not always comfortable talking about it, but talking about it is kind of how you get there, I guess. So.
Well, you tell me. Do you want to explore this subject here in this forum or not? Because it's good either way.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was your position a sort of a sexual subservient, for lack of a better way of saying it, part of a religious scenario? Was it that you were supposed to submit and that included sexually?
Well, that's kind of how it started out. That's the reason why I got married, because I ended up getting pregnant and didn't want my kids to go to hell. And then, I tried talking to my mom a little bit whenever the relationship became really abusive. And she just straight up told me, that you're just supposed to submit and pray about it. And that's why she's in the play. She's never been in a healthy relationship, but her coping mechanism is to convince herself that she deserves the way that she's treated, and that if the more submissive she is, then that's the only way to make the relationship better. And so,
you are where God wants you to be. His ways are not our ways. It may be difficult now, but there's something greater on the horizon kind of thing? Or?
I think it more has to do with, there's a lot of self-blame. So however you're treated is either because, if you get treated badly, it's because of sin in your life, or because, if it's in a relationship, especially in a marriage, it's always the woman's fault. And if a man doesn't treat you right, it's because you're not doing your job. And I believed this, and so even whenever I kind of stopped ascribing to those specific doctrines and stuff, it's internalized. And so you still, even unconsciously, have this feeling like if you work on your relationship hard enough, you can make him better, or you can make him change. We just don't have this realistic understanding that you can't make someone else change, and you're not responsible for someone else's behavior.
Were you convinced that from a religious or Christian perspective that you weren't allowed to say no to your husband, that you should submit? I mean, if he wants to be sexual, he makes the decision?
Yeah, I think it's just the idea that we can say no that never even crossed my mind at all. I didn't even know that I could do that, because you're trained this entire time to do whatever a man tells you. And even now, I feel like I'm all liberated and I'm over that and everything. But even now, sometimes if I get into a relationship or a sexual type of situation, there's certain kinds of, like, I guess you would call it authoritarian types of male behaviors. And it's like a switch goes off, and it's like a reflex to automatically just do what they tell you to do, even when you don't want to.
It's like a relational muscle memory. You did it for so long that way.
And I mean, even outside of the sexual context, it's really hard to get over that. What you think or what you know and what you feel are not always gonna, agree with each other. And it's like watching myself from somewhere else sometimes, and I can look back and see that I've done this, and it's so taboo to talk about this. People don't want to admit it, but a lot of people do experience it. That, like, I've gotten into a situation where I've had sex with guys that I didn't want to, just because I did not know how to say no, and I didn't know how to get out of the situation other than just let them do what they want, and then they'll let me leave.
In the message that you had sent when we had first corresponded, you said, and I'll just quote, "Religion has mind-fucked our entire culture." You want to flesh that out for me?
It's kind of hard to differentiate between what's religion and what's culture, because they intermingle so much. But coming out of what I've came out of, and and being part of the secular community, and I've noticed that I think people don't give enough credit to how powerful religious ideas can really be. And I'm speaking for myself here. I felt like, I know better now, so this isn't going to be a problem for me anymore. But it's so much internalized ideas about gender roles and about sexuality. It takes a lot to come to terms with the fact that you're wrong about something, and to have to rethink everything that you thought in a culture where that's not the norm. And I mean, to the degree that people try to criminalize normal human behaviors, because it's just it's such a strongly felt topic, I guess.
If you're stumbling across a story of someone who was like you, a young girl in a Duggar family situation with these backward ideas, what goes on in your head?
Well, I guess I have a couple of friends left still, a few, but I have a few that are still in that, and I try to be an ear, because I've had a couple that talk to me because I'm literally the only person in their lives that they can talk to about this stuff without somebody judging them, or without, like, you're not even allowed to talk about this really in most of the time. And so one of my friends, she came across my article that I wrote, and she's 30-something. She's one of my best friends when we were in Bible college together. And so she's in a relationship, and she's still a virgin, and she's just like was beating around the bush. Like, she just wanted to talk about sex so much. She didn't know if she could, and so finally she did, and we ended up talking about being comfortable with your body. And then she ended up sending me nude pictures of herself And it was just like it's normal to, to want to look at yourself in the mirror or, to take pictures of your body and, to feel sexual when you're by yourself. But it was I just felt so bad for her because I'm probably the only person on this planet that will ever see those photos.
You think she's struggling with shame and guilt? I shouldn't be feeling this. I shouldn't be thinking this. I shouldn't have these desires.
Yes. And it was just, I guess sometimes, it's possible to be in a relationship in that religion and for it to work out and for you to have a happy family and all of that. But I kind of see the inside of it to where there's so much shame. And part of what they teach us there is fake it till you make it. And to, it's like a sin to not be happy. So, if you come across a family and the wife hates herself and hates her life, you probably would never actually know it.
All right.
I feel really badly for them. And I know other friends who are in a happy marriage and, everybody thinks it's all wonderful and they have kids and they've only ever had sex with this one man and, they love him, but they hate sex. And I think that really comes down to the fact that neither her nor the husband know how to talk about it. Neither one of them know what they're doing, I guess. And it's just, you can never get better if you can't come to the place where you can get over the shame about it.
I know when I'd interviewed Vicki Garrison, who had escaped the Quiverful movement, she said that whole culture presents happiness on the outside, but they're masking tremendous division and dissent and unhappiness and brokenness behind the walls. To the rest of the world, they look like this perfect family. The Duggars look like this perfect family on the outside, but the reality is much different and much darker.
Yeah, and that's what's really frustrating to me when I see people talking about the Duggar family, and because they do look happy. And I'm not trying to be too pessimistic over here, but that doesn't mean anything. Like, it is considered a sin to not be happy with your situation. And if you don't, even if you don't tell anyone, if you just feel unhappy, and I've experienced this too, like then I start wondering, what sin do I have in my life that I need to work on? Is God turning his back on me because I'm not content with what he's given me and all of this kind of stuff?
You mentioned that you were liberated.
Well, for the most part, I guess that was another wake-up call, was realizing it's not just my ex-husband that was the problem, it's the culture that's the problem. And, even when we talk about abusive relationships, we really just want to simplify it down to this one person was abusive. And it's really a cultural thing. And then, and I had someone kind of get mad at me because they thought I was sympathizing with abusers. But to really be honest, it's not just that women get into those situations because of these religious ideas about being submissive and not knowing how to say no and not knowing what a healthy sexual relationship looks like. But then on the other hand of that, the guys really don't either. And I think a lot of times guys can be abusive in that way, and they don't realize that they're being abusive either. And if you can't communicate about it, so you just keep going on in that cycle, and you can never get better. I'll tell you another story real quick. There was another friend of mine, and I think she was about 35. She had 2 kids. So it finally came out, like she was 35, and she had her first orgasm. And she was just like, she had no idea that she hadn't even been having orgasms this whole time. And so she was so excited, she told her husband, and it just totally broke him because he thought she had been this entire time. And this is, decades into a marriage with children. And they couldn't even talk, 35 years old, and she couldn't even talk about it with her own husband.
Well, Amber, I appreciate your time and your perspective. I will link these articles. There are various articles in there. One is about abstinence-only education. One is about why grown-ups need sex ed too. And the other one about marital rape. I'll make sure and just include the links to those in the description box in case any of our listeners would like to go further in that. And thanks so much for being a part of the show today. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you.
More from our listeners on the other side of the break. Dr. Daryl Ray, psychologist and author of Sex and God, will be speaking about how religion distorts sexuality. And David Fitzgerald's going to join us to talk about sexy violence, violent sex, the weird-ass morality of the Bible. All that's coming up on the other side of this. Hang on. It's interesting how the internet has changed and increased our options for getting things done. Like, we used to be stuck with a few FM radio stations, and today we have like thousands of options thanks to the internet and internet radio. We used to rent videos from a video store. Well, today our movies stream directly to us. And where we used to fumble with rolls of stamps and drives to the post office to mail letters and packages, today we can do it all from the convenience of our own desk with Stamps.com. Stamps.com is the better way to get postage, to mail letters and packages, to write to friends, to handle business correspondence, whatever. No more overspending on stamps, no expensive postage meters, just easy-to-use software and official U.S. postage printed from your own computer at your own convenience. Right now, you can sign up for Stamps.com and use my code Seth Andrews. You get a 4-week trial and a $110 bonus offer, including postage and a digital scale. So don't wait. Go to Stamps.com. Before you do anything else, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage and type in Seth Andrews. That's Stamps.com. Enter Seth Andrews. Stamps.com. Never go to the post office again. Today's broadcast is called Religion Screwed Up My Sex Life. I've got an email here from someone I will call Jay. Jay said this: I protected my virginity until I married at age 27. I'm 6'5" and played college basketball at the Assemblies of God's University Southeastern in Lakeland, Florida. Although it was a Christian university, I was constantly propositioned by females and sometimes rather aggressively. It was flattering. But I held to the righteous superiority of my holy covenant with Jesus Christ. I knew that if I would ever fall into temptation, I would live with the guilt that I stole such a precious and holy gift from my wife. But to the contrary, now that I'm an atheist, I realize there was no magic in my virginity, and I constantly wonder what it would have been like to experience different women. Don't get me wrong, I would never step out on my wife, but boy, my college years could have been so much more entertaining. P.S. My wife was not a virgin when we married, and my bitterness caused some strife in our marriage and sex life. I felt that it was disrespectful that she didn't save herself for me. Now that we're both atheists, I no longer have these petty insecurities. So honestly, our marriage has been stronger for the last 6 years since we deconverted than the first 8 years of our God-filled marriage. LOL. Jay, thanks very much for the message. A woman I will call C said this: When I heard you mention this topic, I knew I had to participate. This is something I've been silently struggling with for a long time, and I've never told anyone the whole story. My entire life I was raised in a Pentecostal Christian family, and before high school the only thing I knew about sex was that it was bad. Sex and everything related to it was evil unless you were married. I didn't even really understand what sex was until I was in high school, and I learned everything from my peers and the internet. When I was about 13, I started to learn more about my own body, and I started experimenting and learning what felt good and what didn't. And one day my mother walked into my room and told me that what I was doing was bad and that God was watching me. So I prayed for forgiveness and stopped doing that. About a year later, toward the end of my freshman year, I got my first boyfriend. He convinced me to skip study period with him. The teacher was a bit loony and rarely noticed people missing, so I said sure. I was naive and stupid at the time. His house was nearby, and his mother was at work, and we ended up in his bedroom. Things escalated to a point at which I was uncomfortable, but he wouldn't let me leave. He didn't kidnap me or tie me down or leave any marks, and he was my boyfriend. So for a long time, I didn't even think of it as rape. About a year later, I talked to one of the adults of the church who I knew wouldn't tell my parents. I felt so much guilt. I felt impure. And when I told my youth pastor's wife, she said it was my fault, that God was punishing me for skipping school and going to a boy's house alone. I believed her. I thought no Christian man would ever accept me as a wife, and that it was all my fault. When I was about 16, I started experimenting with my own body again. At this point, my faith was wavering. But the first time that I orgasmed, I immediately broke down crying. Then and every time since, I break down into tears and just feel this heavy weight in my chest, like I'm being crushed by an elephant. Honestly, I'm not sure if it's guilt over religion or over what had happened to me, but to this day, it happens every time. It's only happened once with a partner, and he broke up with me not long after that. Even though I'm an atheist now, I still struggle with it. Even now, I'm at times hesitant to call what happened to me rape. But then I remind myself that no means no, and that sex without consent is always rape and is never the victim's fault. It took a lot of time and learning to realize that what happened wasn't my fault. And I hope maybe someday I will feel fully comfortable with sex and things like that, but it's still at times difficult. I know a lot of people have experienced a lot worse, but I just felt like this was a good time and a good reason to share my story with someone. Well, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. I know many of us are grasping for words of comfort when we hear about this sort of violation, compounded by the violation the church is guilty of when it tells you that actually it was your fault. Any person who would tell a rape victim that it was punishment from God for skipping school or whatever, it just makes the blood boil. It just makes you livid. And it's one of the reasons that we speak out and do shows like this and fight against the insanity being taught as truth with a capital T by the church and the agents of the church. These people may honestly feel like they're doing the good thing or doing the right thing or standing upon moral high ground, but they're doing real, palpable, tangible damage every day. With Dr. Darrell Ray coming up in just a few minutes on the broadcast, he's one of the many people behind Recovering from Religion. It's a wonderful support mechanism for people who have really been damaged by religious thinking and action. And they might be a good resource for you, recoveringfromreligion.org. But thank you for sharing your story. I hope it encourages others and reminds them of where the boundary lines can and should be drawn, and that their bodies belong to them, and that sex can and should be a beautiful thing, no matter how sinful religion says it is. So. I've got Jenica on Skype. Jenica, you're on the Thinking Atheist radio podcast. How are you?
I'm good, Seth. Thanks for having me. Did
religion screw up your sex life?
Yes, it did.
Well, tell me the story in a nutshell. What happened?
Well, I grew up in an evangelical Christian family. Well, first of all, let me just say, if I sound a little weird, it's because I'm a bit under the weather, so I apologize for that ahead of time.
It's okay. It's that time of year. All that stuff's sort of sure going around. So, no, you're fine. You sound great.
Okay. So, yeah, I grew up in an evangelical Christian family, similar to yours, it sounds like. It was a good childhood. I have a wonderful family, great parents and everything, but just victims of bad ideas, like you say.
Yeah.
I got the whole talk about, how important my virginity is before marriage and all that. And I took it extremely seriously. And, the Bible's very clear about how important it is, especially for a woman, to keep her virginity before marriage, especially in the Old Testament. I read Josh Harris's book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, and I took what he had to say to heart. And I felt like if I were to lose my virginity before I was married, that I would lose my complete worth as a Christian woman.
Now, what did you take to heart? What was he saying in the book? Why would you kiss dating goodbye?
He was saying basically that every person that you give a part of your heart to before you're ready to completely commit to someone is damage that you'll bring into your marriage. So he was saying not to have multiple dating partners, like even beyond sex, but just, don't kiss before you're married. Don't, commit yourself in any way to anybody before you commit yourself to the one that God has saved for you. So I didn't date during high school, but I met a boy when I was 15, and, we didn't date, but we fell in love. And when we were 18, we started officially dating, and all those years of pent up sexual frustration finally caught up to us, and we had sex before we were married. And I'm telling you, my life spun out of control at that point, because everything that I had worked for, everything that I found worth in myself was just shattered at that point. And in my mind, I had lost everything. I had lost my worth as a woman to my future husband. Even if it was going to be him, I still felt completely worthless. And I started doing all kinds of ridiculous things. I started cheating on him. I started lying to my parents all the time. And things just kind of spiraled. And I eventually even became suicidal. And all this just because I thought that I was ruined. I thought that I was just a completely ruined person, all because I had sex at 18 years old.
Those who criticize Islam and how Islam treats women, cover them up to keep them pure, to keep them from tempting the man. In many ways, they are vessels or they are objects. Once those objects have been made impure, they are now worth much less, if not worth less. I mean, there is some of that going on in the church, in Christian circles, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And I've met a lot of people since becoming an atheist who say the exact same thing, that their life just spiraled out of control, all because they made what they thought was a mistake. And I've thought about it, and sex could have been a beautiful thing for me with that boy. We had been together for 3 years. We loved each other. We wanted to get married. We could have had this romantic getaway weekend. We were both adults. It could have been a beautiful thing. Instead, it turned into one of the lowest points in my life, all because I had these messed up ideas about what sexuality was.
What informed your perception about sexuality after the fact? What led you into better ideas? How'd you get out?
Well, I actually carried a lot of that guilt into my marriage. I didn't end up marrying him because it was just too much, especially after, my life spun out of control and I started doing all kinds of crazy stuff. We just fell apart. But I did end up marrying a fantastic man, Patrick, and I always felt the shame and the guilt that he was a virgin when he met me and I was not. So I was damaged goods and I wasn't bringing, my full potential to the marriage in my mind. It was actually when I became an atheist that finally all of that burden and all of that shame started falling off of me. And I was able to fully embrace my sexuality and open myself up even more to my husband, which was amazing.
So how pissed off were you when you found out you'd sort of been duped by these damaging, superstitious ideas?
Ooh, I was so mad.
Really?
Oh, I was so mad. I mean, I was mad about a lot of stuff when I finally came out of Christianity, because I started to realize all of the stuff that had damaged me that was completely unnecessary. Yeah, I went through the typical atheist angry phase.
It's common, right? Yeah. We all felt like, how much time did I waste? How many wrong turns did I make just because I'd been living an inherited belief that was screwing me up? I get it.
Right. And I was even suicidal over it, Seth. I almost took my life over how ridiculous those things were. Baffles me still.
What would you say to somebody who was going through some of what you had gone through, if there was a man or woman who had been hamstrung by these bad ideas? I mean, what would you, if you had a chance to go and grab them by the shirt collar and say, hey, look, what would you say?
I would say to embrace who you are, that sexuality is a beautiful thing that is yours. It doesn't make up who you are. It's not what you should base your worth on. Like if I could go to my 15-year-old self, for instance, I would just educate myself. It's a natural, beautiful thing.
You say it very well, Jenica. Thanks for sharing your perspective and your story with our audience, and all my best for you for the new year, okay?
Thank you, Seth. You too.
Next up on my show roster, Dr. Darrell Ray. He's a frequent guest on the show, and he's a friend, a man I greatly admire. He's the author of several books, including Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. Dr. Ray, glad to have you back.
Yeah, good to talk with you, Seth.
You know, it's a common thread. Every time we get together and have a conversation, we're talking about how religion is screwing up people's sex lives, this bondage, and the wrong kind of bondage that they're dragging around every single day. They are hamstrung by bad ideas. It hurts the heart to see these stories lining up one after the other in my inbox. Your email inbox must be the same.
Yeah, I get so many, just so many. And some are just heartrending, heartbreaking.
What are some of the things that you're seeing? I mean, without betraying anyone's confidence, what are some of the trends?
Well, the main trend is that I was told how broken and how dirty I was as a child. And then when I got married, I had a hard time, if not an impossible time, getting over the notion that sex is dirty and that I'm broken, and especially women. You get that message that women are broken, women are wrong, women are the tempters, going back to Eve.
Is it a double standard for men and women? If a man goes out and has multiple partners, even outside of wedlock, culture, even Christian cultures, tends to be less hard on the guy. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I think there are differences by denomination, if you will. It actually sounds kind of crazy, but different sexual messages have a differential impact by sex. I think Protestantism has more of an impact on women than men. Now, it's not huge. I'm not saying it's gigantic, but that's been my observation. Whereas Catholicism seems to impact men more than women. Now, ultimately, it impacts them both. And I can't sit here and say one is totally worse than the other. But what I see in men, Catholic men, have a horrible, difficult time getting over the Madonna whore complex, for example. They want their wife to be the Madonna, but they don't want to have sex with her because they want the whore in their life. And it really gets in the way of relationships among Catholics. Whereas you look at the opposite side in Protestantism, you have this purity culture stuff that really isn't central to Catholic doctrine as much. And so you get women growing up saying, they're marrying their dad, so to speak, at these purity balls and these purity culture things, which is really, really creepy. And they're getting all these weird messages about their sexuality, and they have to stay a virgin and they can never have sex before marriage. And so there's lots of pressure on women in Protestantism. And I think there's more pressure on men in Catholicism.
Back to the Madonna whore thing, is it's the man wrestling with the idea that, he wants a sanctified, holy, sexual relationship, but at the same time he wants to please the more quote-unquote carnal, lustful part of himself.
Yeah. And the man has got a lot of energy, a lot of drive. He wants to be creative. But within Catholic doctrine, the woman is put up on a pedestal, the Virgin Mary, that all women are pure and you should not. Now, they have some of the same messages the Protestants do. I'm not saying they don't. But this notion of female purity seems to be so important in the mind of the man in Catholicism that when they do have sex with a woman, they can't perform as well with their spouse because they really want the whore in bed. It's really confusing. I'm not sitting here saying I know the answer. I just have worked with so many Catholic guys who can't get it out of their head. And so they end up doing things that hurt their relationships and, having affairs outside or hiring sex workers or something. And then that destroys the marriage. And when they come to a sex therapist and they talk about this stuff, they say, well, I just can't see my wife as a sexual being. It's weird. It's really a strange combination, if you will.
I was reading a piece of research earlier in the broadcast about the higher use of porn or at least the equivalent use of porn in red states or in highly religious states. And politically and religiously conservative areas, more and more people are sneaking off to Google search sexually explicit material. This is a kind of repression that's aching to sort of burst out, right? Everything sounds sexual when I talk about it, Darrell. Everything's a double entendre, and I don't mean for it to be, but it occurred to me at the moment. These people are so repressed And all the time, they are not being what they want to be. They're not saying what they want to say. They're not doing what they want to do. So they sneak off into a dark corner and they scratch that itch somehow. And there's another double entendre for you, Daryl. But what's your take on porn use in the red states or in the more conservative religious states? What do you think?
Well, it's clear. We see this trend goes back 20 years. As long as we've had the internet, we've seen this trend of the more religious areas. And this can even be taken clear down to zip code. You can look at the most religious areas and they will have the highest porn use. It appears that what's going on is the people who are most sexually repressed by their religion are going to they have a strong need for adventure, as all human beings do, and they're going to get it one way or the other, in this case using porn. I dare say if we could find statistics on other sexual things, for example, I've been, in my life, I've been to a number of kink events, for example. I am shocked at how many religious people are there, and they're wearing crosses. And they may be on a cross while they're wearing the cross.
I was picturing, I was going to ask you a kink conference. Trying to picture in my mind what we're talking about here.
Oh, well, there's a gigantic kink conference. There's one in Denver called Thunder in the Mountain. There's a couple in St. Louis. They'll have 600 to 1,000 people for a long 2 or 3 day weekend that are just playing and going to lectures on different kink things. I mean, you can learn about all sorts of stuff. They'll have experts there lecturing on everything from how to properly flog your submissive to how to spank somebody to how to tie them up, and it's whole workshops on all this stuff.
It's interesting, how permissive many religious people are allowed to be as opposed to not allowed to be, depending on the church, depending on the culture that you come from. I think I heard one pastor who's doing a relationship conference or marriage conference was saying, as long as it's consensual, it's okay. But there are other people who have very strict rules about what is and is not good sex or appropriate or sanctified sex. Sex for them is not just a physical act. It's not just an act of intimacy between people. It's not just play or pleasure. For them, there's a soul-to-soul connection. And once that seal is broken, it can never be undone.
Right. And that's the propaganda that so many religions have. But it keeps you, I've written about this in my book, The God Virus, about the guilt cycle. What the religion does is teach you at a very early age, 3, 4, 5 years old, to feel bad and guilty about your body. And you get these messages very early. So then as you grow older, when you do something you've been taught is wrong, you will now feel guilty and shame. And it brings you back to the religion that taught it to you in the first place for forgiveness. So from the very early on, religion's giving you these negative sex messages with the ultimate goal of keeping you infected with their particular God virus throughout your life. That's the way it works. It's a very insidious way to keep people coming back to church.
So can you help me understand, there's a couple over here, and they got married at the age of 18, and they have been married for 50 years, and they have been exclusive and monogamous, and they're happy to have one sex partner their whole lives. And then there's another couple over here, and they want more, or they want to branch out, or perhaps they end up in divorce. They're in 2 or 3 marriages. How many relationships? For them, one person was not enough sexually. What explains this? I know it's a very broad and complex question, but in the church, it's once and forever.
Yeah, there's some research going back about 30 years that's really done. I mean, it's continual research that's going on even now on something called social sexual orientation. And what we know now is that just like some people are born very, very extroverted and some people are born very, very introverted and a lot of people are born in the middle. Well, the same thing is true of sexual adventurousness. People are born with a level of adventurousness, not just sexually. I mean, the guy who's going out bungee jumping or the woman who loves to do rock climbing, they have a high level of adventurousness. Then the chances are, if somebody has a high level of adventurousness, they also have a high level of sexual adventurousness. It's actually scored on a 1 to 7 scale. So let's imagine that we've got 2 people who score a 5 or a 6. I'm just use their own scale on sexual adventurousness. They're going to have a hard time staying monogamous because they just love stimulation and difference and excitement and adventure, even in their sex lives. Whereas if 2 people who have a social sexual orientation of a 1 or a 2, they're going to be much less adventurous, much less risk-taking around their sexuality, and they may stay married for 50 years. No big deal. What the beautiful thing about the way the religion works is it speaks to those people who are not sexually adventurous and makes them pure and models for everybody else. And then the church tries to impose its low sexual orientation, a 1 or a 2. If you're a 1 or a 2, you're going to do really well in the Catholic Church, really well in the Protestant Church. You're probably going to do really well in almost any patriarchal religion. But you're going to suffer big time. You're going to have a hard time dealing with your adventurousness if you're somebody who would score a 5, 6, or 7 on the scale. That's the way I explain it. And when I find couples, for example, let's say that a woman, while I'm dealing literally right now with a woman who has a very high, she scores very high, say a 6 or a 7. Her husband scores about a 2. And she is continually tempted to go out and have an affair. So she's trying to negotiate with her husband, and he just cannot understand why she wants to go have an affair. Isn't he good enough for her? And that's the question that comes up over and over again. He's not particularly religious, although he has some hang-ups in my perception. But he just doesn't have a need for a lot of sexual adventure or variety, and she does. So it's a pretty normal thing for couples to have to deal with this, because there's no two couples on this planet that are going to be identical in anything, and especially around sex. So I think it's important to realize that we all have different levels of sexual adventurousness and need for variety, and we need to be open about communicating on that and not try to restrict the other person. If this guy says, well, you can't go have an affair because I don't like to, or I don't want to, or I don't feel the need to, then he's really restricting her sexual expression based upon his own preferences. That's a form of slavery, or a form of I don't know what you'd call it, but it's not healthy for either party.
But if you look at adultery in the biblical context, which is so often taught, especially here in the United States, it's a sin against your partner, it's a sin against God. I understand the issues relating to honesty and how you framed or agreed to frame your relationship. I mean, I get that part. But in the church, adultery is a sin against God. In the Bible, it was often punishable by death. And so people wouldn't think that these ramifications would echo into the 21st century, but the guilt and shame continue to be prevalent even today.
Right. And it just brings people back to church. Somebody has an affair. The first thing they do is they go confess to their spouse and say, I'm going to go back to the minister. I'm going to confess to the priest or the minister. I'm going to get Jesus' forgiveness so I can get back in good with you. And that happens. Lots and lots of couples that are religious are constantly forced to deny their sexuality and deny their sexual expression in the service of this religious notion about purity, sexual purity.
Have you heard of instances of church discipline? They'll bring these people up in front of the congregation to keep them accountable and sort of out them in front of everyone?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you see Jehovah's Witnesses are pretty famous for doing that. But there are some evangelical churches that pretty commonly do it as well.
They feel it's healthy. I mean, this is us as a family. This is like that TV show Intervention. We bring everybody in and everybody talks about why we're just doing this for your benefit because we love you and we want you to have a healthy relationship in the eyes of God. And so therefore, we must hold you accountable. It's framed as an act of love.
It's framed as an act of love, but it is an act of shame. It's an aggressive move as far as the rest of the church on somebody simply expressing their normal, natural sexuality.
A tremendous violation, I would think. I mean, geez, just the whole church has just climbed into your bedroom, man. You know? Wow.
Exactly. And the irony of it is how many of the people they're convicting you and standing there condemning you have done something equally bad themselves. They just didn't get caught.
That speaks to something that one of my listeners had brought up in an email, where those who are standing on the platform of purity now are sneering down sanctimoniously at those who are no longer pure. And there was a high school student, and they had known someone who was sexually active. And this person in the Christian school environment was cast off. It was an us versus them. It was an in-group, out-group thing all of a sudden. I'm now more moral and I'm more superior than you, a divisive mentality.
Very much so. Very much so. And remember, if that person is staying pure, they may be staying pure because they don't have a high sex drive, that they're a low score on social sexual orientation or something like that. So it's not hard for them to stay pure. It's not hard for them to keep their pants on, so to speak.
Yeah. Any advice for somebody who is navigating, even I've spoken often to atheists, even on this broadcast, who they still hear that sort of ringing in their skulls from time to time, that deeply embedded guilt and shame that was sort of transferred into them by parents who taught them bad ideas about sex, and they struggle with it even today. What would you say? Is there a resource for them, ideas you would like them to leave this conversation with? Someone struggling with guilt and shame about their body, about their desires, about what they want out of their sex life.
Well, obviously, I think they could benefit from listening to my podcast, the Secular Sexuality Podcast, because we talk a lot about this kind of stuff. But they could also go out and just read some good stuff. There's lots of good material. And I know this sounds weird, but I think the polyamory community and the books from the polyamory community are among the best at helping people confront those kinds of issues. Now, they're not specifically confronting the religious stuff. Nobody seems to do that very well. That's partly why I do what I do. But whether you want to be exclusive, monogamous, whatever you want to call it, the polyamory communities with books like Opening Up by Tristan Taormino and More Than One and The Ethical Slut, all those books really force you to ask some tough questions about your sexuality and about your relationships with other people. And I just don't see anybody in the, quote, monogamous world doing that and forcing that. And certainly Christian books don't do it. And of course, the third thing is, if you're having trouble, if your sexual life is miserable or bad because of these kinds of trainings that you got early in life, I think it's healthy to go find a good secular therapist and deal with them through that methodology. And when people say, well, I can't afford a therapist, or I'm afraid of the therapist, or whatever, my reply almost always is, well, how much is it costing you now? How much longer are you going to put up with this kind of misery in your life because of a few bucks? It's really important. Get out there and find somebody that can help you.
Well, I'll include a link as well to the Secular Therapist Project in the description box of this broadcast. Dr. Darrell Ray. Darrell, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, my friend. Thank you so much for being here today.
Seth. All right.
To cap the broadcast, I wanted to talk to author and activist and historical researcher and all-around smartass, David Fitzgerald. Hey, David.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm well. We are doing a show called Religion Screwed Up My Sex Life. And the reason I wanted to talk to you is because if so many of these Bible thumpers are going to pitch the Bible as the source of healthy sexuality, this is normal sex. This is godly sex. This is pure sex. I wanted you to help us draw a circle around what the Bible really says about sexuality. I saw the speech you did, Sexy Violence, Violent Sex. Did I remember it right?
That's right. The full title is Sexy Violence, Violent Sex, the Weird-Ass Morality of the Bible.
The Weird-Ass Morality of the Bible. And I thought, perfect. David has to be on the broadcast. How much of this shit do Christians not realize exists? And give me some examples, man.
Well, I mean, for instance, just let's take the classic one, God's perfect plan for marriage. They hammer that 100%. And yet how many people in the Bible actually go by God's perfect plan for marriage? Basically, it's not Moses, it's not Abraham, it's not Joshua, it's not Jesus, it's not Paul. It boils down to basically Adam and Eve and what choice did they have? And Ruth and Boaz. And that story gets a little R-rated when you read it too.
Many people who pitch the Adam and Eve story are talking about them as the parents of humankind. And of all of the characters in that story that didn't, kill each other, no one stops to ask the question, how did we all get here if Eve is the only female in the story? I mean, sex with mom, right?
Exactly. Or somebody. Yeah. Well, I think usually preachers get around that by saying, well, they must have had a lot more brothers and sisters afterwards. Of course, like in in just a few chapters after Cain murders Abel, he goes off into the land of Nod and marries there, and there's cities and people there already. So I'm not sure how that's supposed to work given the basic rationale of the story.
It's still incest, though,
but
right?
It's still incest, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Did you ever tour the Creation Museum where Ken Ham has the section about incest and how it was okay and was part of God's plan? Did you see that?
I've never had the pleasure, but I think the atheists visiting, ironically, are the only people who are visiting it anymore anyway, so I might as well join in.
I did a whole video of it years ago, and I remember thinking, this is just weird. I mean, there's a section about pro-incest display or exhibit at the Creation Museum. It's just bizarre.
Well, what other choice do they have? They have to go pro on it and make up something like, well, it wasn't really incest. It was just sex with close relatives, and it was okay because it was, they had no other choice. Or I think my favorite rationale I heard about that was, well, the genetic code hadn't been defiled yet or something.
We were more pure back then.
Yeah. So it was fine. It wasn't until Noah's time that it got all messed up.
I highlighted a satire article earlier from Landover Baptist about the story of Onan. He pulled out. Can you kind of get into the story here? What's the deal with Onan?
I mean, long story short, what happened is Onan was supposed to impregnate his dead brother's wife. And instead, he pulled out and spilled his seed upon the dust. And so that has been used as the rationale for, and that's why we must never touch ourselves in such a way. But when you actually read the story, I mean, there's so many layers, because on the one hand, the story is not about masturbation at all. It's about not doing your duty and impregnating your brother's wife to avoid the complicated Mosaic inheritance laws. So on one hand, it's completely bizarre from that standpoint. I mean, like every Old Testament story, it's also probably 100% bullshit. So there's that too. So, and I can't help but think part of it, the connection that it got with masturbation, and this is just me spitballing here, but I think because until they understood fully how babies were made, the idea was that the sperm was a tiny little homunculus person, and it was just planted in the field of a woman. And if she was barren, it wouldn't take. But it was all on the woman's fault, because all the sperm, they didn't, no one ever said, oh, the man's sperm's not working. They always said, oh, the woman's barren.
Only the woman can be infertile.
Be barren. Yeah, because clearly they think that sperm contains all these little people. And so when you think of it that way, well, then you can kind of see how they'd say, and that's why masturbation is murder, and that's why gay sex is murder. You can kind of see some inkling of what their mindset might have been.
Give me another example. Anything come to mind? Some weird-ass morality of the Bible?
Well, you did mention incest a little while ago, and it's actually funny how much that's popped up since Trump's become president-elect. And before that, it blows my mind to see what...
Oh, you mean where he's talking about how he would date his own daughter kind of thing? Or
And it's so funny. It's so funny to see Christians who are the only ones who believe in the Antichrist actually voting for the Antichrist in droves and getting him into office. But even more so, to see them split on this whole he likes Ivanka thing, because some of them actually do come after him. And what kills me about that is they'll say, I read recently that this guy quoting Leviticus 18 at Trump and saying, well, if he just read his Bible, he knows that's prohibited from God. And I listened to him and I thought, well, here's the thing. You read Leviticus 18, it doesn't say jack shit about having sex with your daughter. It forbids all kinds of sex with your relatives all over the board. That's the one that no matter where in the Bible you go, Leviticus, in Deuteronomy, wherever you find in the Old Testament, there is not a single place where God says, oh, and you can't have sex with your daughters. Just about everybody else in your family tree is forbidden. But nieces, daughters, I think your mother's brother's wife, not a word.
Does the Old Testament have an obsession with the penis? It sure sounds like it.
It sure does. It sure is. Foreskins, if not the whole thing.
Of course, we talk about the story about David and the Philistines and the 200 foreskins being delivered. Yeah. I just did a speech in California called My Biggest Gripe with Christianity for the Moment, and we were talking about Brendan Powell Smith's Brick Bible or Lego Bible.
The best book. Oh, I love that book.
He's got a Lego depiction of the removal of Philistine foreskins. And of course, it's these little plastic knobs. And he's got a barrel of them, and he's sort of unloading them and counting them out all the way to 200 in front of King Saul. It is one of the best things ever, David. That's awesome.
That's the only atheist book that I frequently see being sold on Christian venues. And even when they find out it's written by an atheist, they're still selling it. So
the people I talk to, they get all flipped out because, this is disgraceful, this is disrespectful, this is an outrage.
This is word for word exactly what it says in their book. So.
Freaking literal stories of the Bible depicted in literal ways. They are offended by them, but if they see them in an oil painting or something, they're just fine with it. It's bizarre.
Right. It is bizarre how much what they say and do. I mean, being washed in the blood of the Lamb, they say that 1,000,000 times a year, and yet do they stop and once think about what they're saying,
Yeah. Any other immorality plays from the Bible or anti-morality plays that come to mind before I...
Where do we start? That talk you mentioned, sexy violence, violent sex, the weird-ass morality of the Bible, I am planning on making that into a full-blown book as soon as I've got a couple more books down the pipeline.
Oh, that's all kinds of awesome.
That is
all kinds of awesome.
I think it's going to be super fun. One thing that I don't get into so much in the talk that I just sort of hint at is a thing called There's Something About Paul, and talking about how Paul, which is all men were like he was, perfectly able to withstand the temptations of women.
He's gay? I mean, what are you talking about?
No. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I think he's super, super gay. That's what I'm saying.
You ever get into the Song of Solomon? You ever get into some of those wacky verses?
I'm known for it. Yeah, absolutely.
You know what? I actually just had a flash. Didn't you and Cara Santa Maria act out part of the Song of Solomon with like some bongo drums and stuff?
It's the highlight of the show. We actually use porn music for it. but yeah, it's the highlight of the whole show.
It's a bizarre sort of, the language is, I guess it's supposed to be erotic, but the words, it's like there was sort of a word transposition. I can't get my head around it. What is it?
It is super sexy if you are a Bronze Age shepherd and the only thing that's pretty is, goats coming down the hill from Gilead, and, your eyes are like the fish pools of Heshbon, or your nose is like the Tower of Damascus, this kind of thing.
Your eyes are like the fish pools of Heshbon. Oh, yeah. I'm getting hot right now just thinking about it.
Side breasts are like twin fawns. It actually is a great poem because, for one thing, it's one of the few books in the Bible that makes no mention of God whatsoever. It's all about these two sexy gods, It seems to be about these two older pagan gods, Tammuz and Ishtar Shalmuth.
Was it borrowed then from another religion or earlier mythology?
It sure seems to be.
Well, Song of Solomon was always the book that was pitched to us to prove that God was pro-sex. God created sex. It's a beautiful thing.
Oh, no. It's a beautiful allegory for God's chosen people and his love for them, or Jesus and the love of the church, or something.
Yeah, the bride of Christ kind of thing.
All the talks about, your breasts are like a cluster of palm trees, and I will climb that tree and put my hands on. That's just, God's love for us,
The scriptures are even better when spoken by you. Just narrate the Bible, David. Narrate the whole Bible.
It's on my short list. We'll get that done.
Is that speech online anywhere that I could link it?
Honestly, I think it's all over the internet on YouTube. Just punch up sexy violence, and I think it'll pop up.
Okay, everybody, sexy violence, violent sex, David Fitzgerald. We've merely stuck a toe in the ocean here. There's so much crazy shit in the Bible, but I just wanted to have a moment of levity to talk about some of that stuff. And if you ever get a chance to see David on the road do this material, please do so. Aren't you working on another Jesus book, David?
I sure am. It's called Jesus, Mything in Action. And if you've read my book, Nailed, and said, well, okay, I see that's not true. But then where did Christianity come from? This is the book for you.
Well, Nailed is one of my favorite books on Jesus for several reasons. One is that it's so digestible and so well put together. And so if you're doing like a round 2 on that sucker, I'm very excited. Is there a release date? Do you know what's going on? Or
I'm working on it as we speak. I'm just trying to get the crazy pre-production things done, like the book covers and the nuts and bolts of actually getting your self-published book self-published. And I'm hoping to have it out by the end of the month, if I didn't just jinx it by saying that.
Oh, geez, that's much faster. I was thinking maybe end of the year. That's pretty cool.
No. This is 4 years in the making. 4 years in the making.
Let's talk again. Let's have you back here once the book releases and, I know the dust is settling and all that stuff. But I think we should come back and do another Jesus-related podcast. And you can kind of get into how this book is different than Nailed. And we'll do a whole show on Jesus. That work for you?
That would be awesome. And especially tell your friends who aren't on board with the myth theory, who think, oh, no, atheists should just drop that because it's crazy nonsense. This is the book for them.
All right, Bart Ehrman. There's a show coming up in.
Bart.
No, I'm just kidding.
I would love Bart to read this book.
I like Bart Ehrman's work. I watched a lot of his video series. I've got several of his books here. I'm aware of the criticisms of some of his material as well, and I think those criticisms have merit. I think I'm probably leaning more mythicist at this point in my life, but. That's a hot conversation to have these days. So
it really is, and it's because the cracks in the official story aren't going away. They're just being more and more brought to the forefront.
All right. We'll have that show later on, maybe February or March. Deal?
That would be awesome.
Thanks so much for being a part of the broadcast. Great to talk to you, friend.
Take care, Seth.
This is a subject we will probably have to cover again down the road, the subject of religion and how it affects sexuality. So many stories submitted by our listeners I couldn't get to today because of time constraints. So many angles to approach the subject with. Thank you so much to everybody who did submit something. Coming up next Tuesday, don't forget our broadcast is going to be called God, Guns, and Glory, Religion, and the Military. That's going to be a fascinating exploration into how God speak and God-based thinking has often infected military culture. So that's coming up next Tuesday on the Thinking Atheist radio broadcast. Have a great week, and I'll see you then.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter. Watch dozens of original videos on the Thinking Atheist YouTube channel. And visit our website for resources, links, contact information, the editor's blog, and more. thethinkingatheist.com.